The Tom Sumner Program. Old-fashioned radio for a new generation.
I'm going to do something live with maritime documentary film maker and coiner of the phrase mixtery, Ric Mixter. Rick, welcome to the show.
Good to talk to you.
And Rick, I learned a new word this week. It's mixtery.
That's actually copyrighted. You owe me one nickel every time you say it.
Oh, if I had a nickel for everybody I owe, I'd have a whole lot of nickels.
I don't think you'll find the definition in the dictionary, but it's somewhere between a mystery and a story that is mostly factual, as much as I can find the truth in all of my research. But yeah, the mixtery is a history or a mystery that's been told by Ric Mixter, and in only a way that I can share.
Rick, I always make fun in October of people that celebrate, radio stations celebrate Rocktober, and there's Shocktober and Oktoberfest, and we celebrate Schlocktober here on the Tom Sumner program. But I noticed from one of your recent Facebook posts the history of a big storm in the Great Lakes, centennial anniversary, and the downing of a ship. We're kind of in shipwreck season aside from Halloween, right?
Oh, we really are. I mean, if you think about the lakes that have been heating up all summer and record temperatures for warmth in Superior and even Lake Huron in Michigan, and of course that goes downstream to Ontario and Erie. Now it's off. As it cools down, it's now evaporating into the atmosphere. And then add in the Canadian cold fronts that are coming in, and it causes the amazing lows that bring in the gales of November. But we feel them in September, October, November, and that's a time then most of the ships are trying to get their cargoes in before the big winter freeze. So back in the early days, it was a time when people took a lot of chances, and sadly, there's over 5,000 shipwrecks on the bottom that are there because people took bad chances.
Well, yeah, it's from now until until the lakes freeze over. It's sort of a race to see who's the last one sailing.
Really, and many of the early captains actually got bonuses, but the big 100th anniversary this year is October 20th of 1916, and that's one of the worst storms to hit Lake Erie, which, as sailors know, because of its shallow depth, it gets stirred up really easily. And unfortunately, in this one, we had 4 ships go down, and the big folklore is that the captain always goes down with the ship. But in the Black Friday storm, there were actually 2 captains who were the only survivors from their ships. So of those 4 ships that went down, 3 captains came back, and 1 was lost on the Merida.
Is it a little bit, I don't know how to phrase this exactly, is it a little bit weird that there's a shipwreck season, or that we're even aware of it, acknowledging it? Yeah,
I think it's weird. I mean, and people ask me that a lot. I had a lecture last night. I've got 3 this week, and you wonder where the interest comes from. And the truth is, it's not the loss, the terrible loss that we see even from the 1913 storm was 240, 250 sailors lost in one weekend in 1913. It's not the deaths, I think. It's more, for me, the rescues and those amazing survivals of the ships that made it through. Many times when people make mistakes and lives are lost, that's tragic, but it's not super interesting. But when it's Mother Nature that's stirring up 40-foot waves on the Great Lakes, and we have these people that take that on, I think that becomes interesting. And for me, it's the fact that we have 300 years of maritime history that's preserved on the Great Lakes bottomlands that no one can see except for those who put on tanks. So I've taken it as my life's challenge to unlock those mysteries, those mixteries, and bring them and share them to other people so that they can learn from this past that's been perfectly preserved beneath our waves.
Is there any place else on the planet that has the kind of conditions that we have weather-wise and in relationship to having the Great Lakes and the shipping and industry that happens around the Great Lakes? Is there any place else on the planet where
Oh, sure. I mean, obviously the oceans are one, and the waves are different. And the Great Lakes, they can come from many different directions and be very confused. Whereas on the ocean, even during a hurricane, they come at a certain timing, and you can pitch and you can yaw. On the Great Lakes, there's a lot of the guys who went on both who said on the Great Lakes you do both, and that's because it bounces off the shore and they're constricted in some areas, and the waves are just extremely difficult to try to navigate. The Baltic Sea is another example of similar waves that come up, and their conditions in their water also preserve wrecks too, which we see things that are hundreds of years old there. We get 200 years here, and we're pretty lucky. But on the Baltic Sea, they can go even farther back with their their maritime histories. But I would definitely put the amount of ships that we have and the amount that we haven't found yet on a list all by itself.
Now, you've done a lot of research on some of the best known maritime disasters. The Edmund Fitzgerald comes to mind immediately, of course. But of all of the shipwrecks that you've researched and or explored yourself, is favorite's not the right word, but is there one
Sure.
that seems premier in your mind?
No, and I guess a lot of people ask me that too. What's your favorite documentary you did, or what's your favorite story in your book that you wrote? For me, it really, each story takes on a completely different flavor on how the person might have survived or who the rescuer was. So every one of those stories, I could do an hour on any of the 150 ships I've seen underwater. There's certainly people are most interested in the Edmund Fitzgerald. I dove that in '94 in a submarine, and I certainly have some observations and 20 years of research on that. So I try to share that. But I've also been, a very good student of the great storms from 1905, 1913, 1940. I was the first to interview the survivors from the Novadoc, and the only one that has footage of the rescue of the crew of the Novadoc, the only survivor that came out of that big storm. The Minch and the Davik were both lost with all hands. So I've just been very lucky to dig, find new material that no one has really known about, and in some cases actually change the way history was written on it. So I take that very seriously, and I continue to dig those things up, and each one becomes my favorite as I get near completion of it. And quite honestly, because we see it so much, by the time I finish it, I don't like it so much, but when I get to go back and revisit it, Deep Six was made 20 years ago, and it just blows my mind.
Yeah, of course. You mentioned almost parenthetically about the pristine condition that a lot of these shipwrecks are in, or at least the history that's available because they're there and preserved in some way. What is it about sunken ships that allows them to be still basically intact?
We have no woodworms, which the ocean has. So if you've seen video from or any film from the Titanic, all of the people who were lost, the bones and everything have been eaten away by these biological creatures that, that's what they do. That's why wooden ships on the ocean don't last very long if they don't put sheathing over the top or a certain kind of paint. All of that wood gets eaten away, but the Great Lakes will preserve these. So even the 1679 shipwreck Le Griffon, which literally is 300 years old, we still believe we would see much of the hull that's there if it wasn't too shallow and ground up by our ice. If it gets below 70, 80 feet, you get remarkable preservation. They just found a steamer that had all of its cabins on it. The Hydrus, a big metal ship from 1913, was finally found a year ago, and they're in remarkable shape. Even with masts that stick up, the ship might be at 200 feet deep, and these 70-foot masts are still poking into the surface like massive telephone poles, that almost touch the surface. So we get, and even the cargoes. A vessel that's off of Alpena that they found sank on the day Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and the corn in there is still yellow.
Really, it is in some ways. This is kind of an awkward term, but it's kind of a living museum, isn't it?
I believe it is. Ice Water Mansion is how Gordon Lightfoot put it. We believe these are museums, and that's the respect that we give them. This is a place that we can go and not touch, not move things around. We consider them to be graveyards on the ones that have lost loved ones, people that might be centuries old now, or even the Edmund Fitzgerald that was just lost, decades ago. These are grave sites, and even for the ones that didn't have a loss of life, they might have been in a collision and the waters weren't so stirred up that the lifeboats allowed them to get everybody off. There's still, time capsules that deserve our respect. I wouldn't go into any museum and move things around or put my hands on them or roughhouse them. I certainly won't do it with my scuba gear on.
Or take bits and pieces home.
No, and that's even when people have asked me, they say, would you like this piece that we recovered in 1940 because you're so interested? I said, no, that needs to go to a museum. I don't want to have any artifacts. I had a chance to collect a cup that was on the Edmund Fitzgerald. We had a submarine that could have picked it up, and there's a lot of me that was pulling to say, well, it might not be from the Fitz, and it might just be junk on the bottom, but I knew that if I started that, even taking one little taconite pellet from the 26,000 tons that are down there, I just don't believe that should be brought up. And I certainly shouldn't be the repository of these things. And my job is to tell the story, not collect the things that are there and now have something less for somebody else to see when they go down.
How much is there, like, just tons and tons and tons of iron ore that was being shipped that sank, or have there been recovery efforts by the companies that own the ore?
Yeah, there became salvors who were very, very adept to recovering cargoes, and many of the wrecks are splayed open on the bottom where these, they would find the wreck by just dragging until they found it. Remember, this early technology from the 1800s to the 1900s until we had sonar was very difficult to find something underwater. But they would literally drag hooks until they hit something in the area where the captain said it went down, and in many cases over 100 feet deep. And some of these guys not only took the cargo, but they attempted to get the ships. They would get the insurance company to clear it, and if they raised it up, it would be theirs, and that would be their profit. So people like Reed, who was out of Bay City and Port Huron, was amazing at bringing these up. And we even have evidence of some of the wrecks he couldn't bring up that are now have these giant pontoons that he tried to fill with air, and they're still floating underwater, never to be recovered. So it's an amazing history that's down there, and it's just waiting for us to go down and capture that story, tell what's down there, and share it with everyone else.
Now, with the technology that we have now, are the remains of most ships mapped and accounted for, or are there still many discoveries to be made?
My guess would be that, and I'm just guessing, that we probably have maybe 400 ships that have been discovered, and probably of those, maybe 70 or 80 of them are regularly dived by divers. There's over 5,000, some people say up to 10,000 shipwrecks that are in the Great Lakes, and most of them are in very deep water. That Lake Superior is 1,200 feet deep, Lake Michigan 800, Lake Huron is close to that, Lake Erie is 70 feet, but there's a hole that is about 200 feet, and somewhere in there's a car ferry that vanished, the Marquette and Bessemer number 2, and we can't find it. The largest ship lost from the Great Storm of 1913, James Carruthers, is 550 feet long. We can't find it. It's in Lake Huron someplace. So they're very good at hiding. There's a lot of bottomlands to try to search, but the technology is getting so great that anybody with a fish finder could ride over a wreck and almost tell you what ship that was by a measurement and by the incredible return picture that you get from even these little hummingbirds.
With the, was it you, Rick, that told me there was a German submarine at the bottom of Lake Michigan?
Yeah, there's a U-boat that was put on display after World War I, and it was moved around the Great Lakes. There's a lot of pictures of it. It was moved then to Chicago, and then after the armistice, and we tried to make peace with Germany, they agreed it wouldn't be in good faith to have this submarine laying out there, so they brought it out and sank it. And the ship that actually sank it was one of the worst disasters ever on the Great Lakes. the old Eastland. It was a ship that rolled over in the Chicago River, and over 800 people drowned going to a picnic. But it's just ironic that that submarine was sent to the bottom after the Eastland was converted into a warship and had guns on board. They put holes in the sub and sank it in 200 feet. And it was discovered, I think, in the 90s, and they're still trying to decide what they're going to do with it. I think the company was AT&T Salvage or something like that out of Chicago, and they've been bringing up a lot of the old World War II airplanes that are in the lake that were training there. So they've got the submarine and haven't given up the coordinates, so I haven't been there yet.
How did the submarine come to be in the Great Lakes to begin with?
They took it on display. It was a war prize, and they said, everybody
Okay.
look at the Scourge. These Nazi U-boats were highly effective from World War I into World War II especially, and they were feared, and people wanted to see what they looked like. So they took it on patrol. They brought it through the Welland Canal and all the way up into the Great Lakes and through the around to Chicago, and it was on display for some time. But because they decided that they couldn't keep it, they sank it. The good news is we do have a World War II Nazi submarine on display in Chicago at the Institute for Technology or the Science Museum that's there,
Yeah.
and it's actually inside a building. It's a gorgeous vessel to see, and it's perfectly preserved. So we still have one. The other one sits underwater and probably won't be raised. I don't know where they would find the funding to do that.
You do a lot of public speaking and lectures, workshops and things about Great Lakes maritime disasters, and you've been to what you said, like 150 different shipwrecks yourself. How do you divide up the time? I mean, are you still getting out and doing dives? How much time do you spend doing these presentations?
I wish, we all wish it was all, underwater. It's some of my favorite is actually looking and going to these new things that are being discovered all the time. But I am limited by, I still have a full-time career as a videographer. I have to do that. I do a lot of lectures, and that helps to put air in the tanks and help me to put together boat trips to be able to go out and to record. And gear is always changing. It's so expensive to have the latest and greatest and high definition gear because that's changing so frequently. So I don't get out as much as I want. In fact, we just found relocated a wreck that I have amazing pictures on that's up on Manitoulin in northern Lake Huron, and I did not get out there this summer at all, and I'm dying. I wish I could get up there and see it, but I had a little issue with my heart too, which was fixed, and now I'm up to full strength, and I would love to get out there, and unfortunately now the waves are picking up.
Yeah, what is the season like for you? When do you consider? I mean, this is kind of throwing back to the same decisions that some of those captains were making, but when do you decide it's the season's over?
As soon as we get a good hard freeze, no one wants to take their boat out anymore because it's got water in it. That's part of the way the engine's cool. So once they get really to a hard freeze, most people want to put antifreeze in there and store their boats, which is sad because those lakes are as warm as they're going to get. Only now are they starting to cool. So it's the warmest they'll be. But most of us try to get out as soon as the ice goes away, and that's horrible for temperature. It's always the coldest, but it's always the clearest because no boats are around to stir it up, and
Right.
the ice melts off, and the waves are usually halfway decent to get out there. Now, if we can get a good weather and a good Indian summer couple of days, we could still get out. But no one likes to pretend that in 2 weeks we'd be able to get out. So it happens less and less. If it's given to us, it's a godsend, and we'll go. But I don't think that we do a lot of planning that says, hey, let's make sure we block this weekend, because it's very rare that we'll be able to get out. And even more so, it's hunting season now, too, so maybe my interests get a little bit more into a tree and a little less into the waves now. So.
What is your next big project, or what are you working on now or next?
We really want to go see this vessel on Manitoulin, and I continue to do research on Le Griffon, which was discovered about 20 times over the last, since the 1930s. We've had a lot of recent television coverage of just pieces of garbage on the bottom that TV stations jumped right away and said, hey, they found Le Griffon, and it wasn't. We even had French archaeologists come over to try to look at a pole that was on the bottom that was a net stake for a fish net, and they came all the way over here just to see that, and it's just been kind of a funny story in a way. I'm very honored that there's that much interest in Great Lakes shipwrecks, but it's also sad because it overshadows a lot of the amazing finds that have been made. From the 1913, the hydrus that was found.
Yeah.
They found a couple of schooners that are just as important. And on Lake Ontario, Jim Kennard continues to find shipwrecks. Not too far off, I think 2 years ago, he found the largest shipwreck ever lost in Lake Ontario. And I challenge every one of your listeners to tell me what the name of that ship is. Nobody knows about it, but it's an incredible ship. It's called the Nisbet Grammar, and it's in deep water, and I'd love to get some shots. That would complete my stories.
We're just about out of time, but I want to make sure that you share some resources with listeners where they can find out more about what we've been talking about.
You bet. You're always welcome to go to Lake Fury, as in the storm, lakefury.com. You could go to Ric Mixter, RICMIXTER.com. You could just Google Ric and Shipwrecks, and you'll find out a ton of stuff. Or look for us on Facebook. Lake Fury is on Facebook, and our concerts that we do storm all around the Great Lakes. Our next one's in Sheboygan on November 19th. 2-hour concert with Dan Hall. It's a fantastic way to learn about shipwrecks.
Great. Ric Mixter is my guest. We'll be back with more.
The Tom Sumner Program. Old-fashioned radio for a new generation.